Hi everyone, in this video I discuss the differences between will, going to and present progressive to talk about the future. So I'd like to show you some conceptual differences that underline each of these different constructions. In order to do that, we need to inspect the conceptual structure that is particular to will, to going to, and to present progressive to talk about fixed arrangements. Just let me remind you that you can check all of this information in much further detail in our cognitive grammar seminar website, sites.google.com/view/cognitive grammar. I will leave a link to this site below the description of this video. So going to for plans and will for predictions. Those are the first two constructions that I'd like to discuss. I'd just like to mention that I'm just going to focus today on plans and predictions, particularly by the end of this video, but of course we know that will and going to are used for far many more things than just plans and predictions. So let's start with going to for plans. What is one common situation that calls for the need to use going to? This is one situation where your plans for the weekend. We very often want to talk to our friends what we plan to do over the following days in the weekend. And one plausible thing to do is to read a book. We could say, I'm going to read a book next weekend. And what comes to your mind when you think about this? Probably something like this, especially if you are very young and you can sit next to your window and if you want to enjoy your cup of coffee while you're reading. But it could be something else that comes to your mind. Maybe you're sitting on a chair next to with your book on a wooden table and with a little plant next to you, or something like what I'm showing you right now. What else could come to your mind? Maybe you are sitting on a couch and you have your cup of coffee and your cell phone near you, or maybe you plan to take a trip or travel somewhere and you will use your time on the bus to read a book. Or you plan to go to a library and read your favorite book from that library. Or you could also go to a library but have not one but several books that you have to read, and you could have your cell phone next to you because you're waiting for a phone call. Or something else, maybe you are sitting on a sofa relaxed, reading your book that you just bought. But let's go back to this first example that I showed you. Let's think that this is more or less what comes to the mind of a young person who plans to read a book over the weekend. We have to ask ourselves, we know that we all have different ideas of what it is to read a book over the following days. But is it possible for our brains, for our minds, to defocus, to blur out the details of the event, in this case reading a book? So this is the question. Does our mind have any mechanism to defocus the details of this event? Are we in the capacity, are we able to do that? And more particularly, do we have any linguistic mechanism to achieve this? Let's think about this from a sheer conceptual point of view first. So take this image, this picture. It probably corresponds or not to what you have in mind, but let's say that you are able to defocus the details, to blur out the details of this event in the way that I'm showing you right now. It's very difficult to tell what exactly each person has in mind when he or she is thinking about reading a book over the following days or during the weekend. But let's think that if you were to think about something like this situation or this image that I'm showing you right now, let's think about the possibility that you're able to defocus the details, to lose sight of the many different details that surround this event. How much can we blur out such details? Can we blur it out like this? Probably you just think in a very schematic, extremely schematic way, without without any detail in your mind. We don't really know what's going on in our brains, but we can try to get an idea or figure out what is more or less going on in our minds. Or maybe something like this. It's quite blurred out. Or maybe something like this. Or like this, probably. Or maybe like this. It's barely recognizable as what we had at the beginning. As I have already said, we don't really know what's going on in our minds, but let's think that it is possible to blur out the way we perceive or think or conceive of a particular event in our minds. Maybe like this. This is just a few shadows here and there. It's difficult to tell what's going on in our minds, but let's think that it's possible to omit, to ignore the many different details that surround one given event. Let's take this one step further and make it even more extreme. And let's think that it's just a black dot in our minds about something we want to do, such as reading a book the next weekend. We can make it smaller and smaller and smaller. So these are ways of thinking about what comes to our minds when we think about reading a book. And this is precisely what many commercial grammars have indeed shown on their visual explanations. They usually say that will is used to talk about events that will take place at one point in time in the future. And they will usually cross out one little dot in a timeline, and that's because the idea is that the event is concentrated, it is compressed in one single point in time. Let's keep that idea in mind. So let's propose that will for predictions has precisely this kind of conceptual nature. So if that were to be true, then we could say that going to for plans is a construction that evokes many details. How many? We don't really know, because nobody knows what really is going on our brains. But we do know that something is being evoked, and we do know that with going to, the degree of details that are being paid attention to is far greater than the degree of details that are evoked by will. Of course, within an ideal model of analysis. If we were to include contextual effects, this is going to be much more complicated, but let's keep it simple for now. Let's just separate these two conceptual categories between going to for plans, where you evoke many details, and will for predictions, where you don't really pay much attention to the details. But in order to make more sense of this, we need to analyze in further detail the conceptual nature of the verb go. In order to talk about the future with going to, we need to use the verb go, and if we use the verb go, we need to understand better what the particular elements and conceptual structure and nature of the verb go as a motion verb are. So first of all, you got to consider that for the verb go, there is a first element, which is the source or the departure point where you start the journey, the movement, the motion of going somewhere. Secondly, you have a final destination, which we usually term or name technically the goal. And thirdly, we have a trajectory or pathway that we go across, that we have to walk by or run through, or whichever other way of motion we choose to engage with this trajectory. So these are the first three elements: the source, the goal, and the trajectory or pathway. And finally, as for the basic elements, there are more, but the basic ones are those three, and of course the entity, the person or object of the universe that is moving. In this example, it is a girl that wants to read a book. So she's going to read a book over the weekend, during the weekend. And of course, many other things are going to happen from now until the moment at which she finally sits down and starts reading. So that's what we are trying to show here with this image. Now, with will, we blur out the details of the surroundings. With will, we don't really pay so much attention. We don't really have much care about um, the general details, the surroundings of the person conceptualizing the event in the here and now and the event taking place later on in time. So that's one difference. If we want to take this to a much greater extreme, we could say that there is indeed nothing surrounding the conceptual space between the here and now and the future time at which we will do something. Um, is our brain doing something more like this, as a blank space between the here and now and the future time, or is it more like this? We don't really know. It's probably something in between these two ideas, and it's also very probable that sometimes it's more like this and some other times it's more like this. That's something that is not solved yet. There is much research to be carried out about this, and we shall see in the future if this is answered in 10 or 20 years from now. But for now, let's just keep in mind that there are conceptual differences in the sense of what I've been showing you. So for now, let's keep it simple and say that going to focuses our attention on the surroundings and the details of the event, and that will defocuses the surroundings and many of the details of the event that we are conceptualizing. But what about present progressive for fixed arrangements? What's particular? What's going on with present progressive for fixed arrangements? What is the difference between these and the other two constructions that I just discussed? Well, with present progressive, what is most important to begin with is that the initial steps that have to be taken in order to arrive to our final destination are almost completely blurred out, ignored, omitted. They are not really taken into account. And so we picture ourselves already there. We see ourselves already doing what we want to do. So for example, I could say, I am reading a book next Sunday. Present progressive, I am reading a book next Sunday, as opposed to I am going to or I will read a book next Sunday. In which case, we have a maximal control of the situation. We could say that we can imagine ourselves doing the thing, in this case reading a book, and because we are already there, we can control everything that has to be done in order to be successful at reading our books. Because we are already there, we can control everything, and that is a maximal focus, not on the trajectory, not on anything that has happened before, but on the event itself. So we would say that that's a maximal focus on the event. And we have another example. To make this clearer, let's analyze this other example. What about I'm having lunch with my friend on Sunday? If I were to say this example, the difference between going to for plans and will for predictions is that everything has already been arranged. Me and my friend have already discussed where we want to go, why we want to go there, how we'll get there, and so on and so forth. Everything has already been figured out. And because of that, we need a construction that maximizes such control of the situation and such maximal focus on the details of what will be taking place at one given point in time in the future. So that's something that present progressive does very well. I'm having lunch with my friend on Sunday. Attracts our attention to the very event itself in a way that we can concentrate our attention on everything that we expect to happen at that very moment. That's why we say that we use present progressive for fixed arrangements because we're able to fix everything that has to be fixed in the sense of arranging everything so that we have a nice lunch with a friend. So that's basically the idea behind present progressive. I won't go any further into this. We could do that some other time. But let's think about this from a general point of view of grammatical constructions. As you can see here, there are many other grammatical constructions that we haven't discussed. But let's focus our attention on this window here, the one that I'm showing you with my cursor, and this sphere, this black sphere or dot, black dot that I have placed here above in the right upper corner. So with will, we can talk about predictions, and we're going to represent this construction with a black dot or sphere precisely because, as I have already mentioned, will is a sort of construction that is able to defocus all the different aspects, details of the future event. We don't really care about the surroundings or the details of how things will happen. And that's something that is just natural for a conceptual frame of predictions because the conceptual nature of a prediction is one such that we don't really know whether it will happen or not. Am I able to predict who the next winner of a sport competition will be? Not really. We could have different ideas of what team or person will be the winner in a competition, but because we're not able to see everything, because there are so many possibilities, we prefer to use will because will is very good to achieve such type of conceptualization. On the other hand, with going to, we don't have this concentrated blackish dot or sphere that doesn't give us much information about the surrounding details. We instead have a window of attention. We have this relatively big window that allows us to think about the different details. To what extent we can see those details is difficult to tell, but we do have some attention to the general details. So that's why we have here going to for plans, for intentions, for something that I want to do over the following hours or days. Of course, it is expected that going to is also good for predictions based on evidence, precisely because you're able to look at what is going on around. For instance, let's say that I look out my window and I see black clouds, then I have evidence, I have seen something in the surroundings that allows me to predict that something is about to happen. It's going to rain, or something is going to fall. In those examples, we're going to use the construction going to, precisely because going to opens a window of attention. So plans and predictions based on evidence are naturally connected to going to. In contrast, will is usually preferred to talk about things over which we don't really have much information of the surroundings, of the details that make up the event that we have in our minds. We also have will for spontaneous decisions. That's somewhat different. We also say that we use will for offers and many other pragmatic events. And that's simply because if you think about it, when you are using will, what you are doing is that you are losing sight of the many details, and if you're taking a spontaneous decision, you didn't plan anything about that particular decision. Let's say, for example, that the phone starts ringing at home, and I say, okay, I'll take it. I'll go and answer the phone. I'll go, or somebody's knocking on the door, and I can say, I'll go and see who that is. All of those examples of spontaneous decisions are preferably expressed with will, precisely because will doesn't take into account any surroundings, because if you're taking a spontaneous decision, you were not thinking about the general situation overall. You are focusing your attention just on the final action, which is answering the phone or opening the door. So to summarize, going to specializes on the following. We focus our attention on the surroundings, and we focus our attention on the details of the event. In, um, in contrast with Will, we defocus our attention from the surroundings, and we defocus our attention from the many details of the event. And finally, with Present Progressive, we are able to achieve a maximal focus on the details of the event. We have maximal control. Control is a very important concept when we want to discuss Present Progressive, because we present ourselves, we picture ourselves as already being there in the future. We sort of defocus our surroundings because we are already there in the future. We don't really care about the here or now. We care much more about the future that is in our mind. We make it feel as if it already were here, as if I were already with my friend having lunch. Or if I say I'm having a meeting next Monday at 8 a.m., I can already see myself there, and because it is a fixed arrangement, I have much control on over many of the aspects that surround this event: where, when, with who, why, how, etc. All of that is taken for granted. So the initial surroundings are defocused, but we focus maximally our attention on the final event itself. And you don't really need to learn these definitions or these semantic traits. What you really need to remember is that with going to, you sort of evoke what the pathway or the trajectory or everything that has to happen in order for me to read a book next weekend um, has to happen. With will, in contrast, I don't really take into account the details of the trajectory and the way I'm going to get there and all of that. I have defocused my attention away from all of that, and I just concentrate on the final event itself. And with Present Progressive, I imagine myself already there, and because I am already there, I am doing the thing, I am having a meeting, I am having lunch, etc. I have so much control over what is going on. That's what Present Progressive is so good for, that I am able to say that it is a fixed arrangement. I have already arranged everything so that I have a successful lunch or a successful meeting with my colleagues. And well, that's all for now. I have laid out just the basic principles and ideas surrounding will, going to, and present progressive to talk about the future. But if you really want to get deep down into the discussions of these different problems, I recommend that you go back to our cognitive grammar seminar website. I will leave a link to this website in the description below this video. Also, I'd like to mention that within a matter of just a few days, there will be a conference on metaphors and space. This is going to be online. It's a little bit expensive, not too much, but yeah, it's kind of expensive, I would say. I think it's about 30 euros. But this is just to give you an idea of how much there is to discuss. I will not be able to cover everything that has to be said about metaphors and space and time in just 20 or 25 minutes, but I do want to extend a gentle invitation for everyone to engage more into these matters. There is so much to learn, but I hope that what I have shown you is at least sufficient for now to give you a sense of what's going on behind the scenes of these different constructions from the point of view of cognitive linguistics and from the point of view of conceptual structure. And well, that's all for now. I hope to see you later. I'll be around. See you.